Morgan Darian with Los Angeles Public Poetry and Prose Project with bestselling author Katharine Haake to glean a little bit of wisdom about writing and to talk a bit about her new eco-fable called What Happened Was. So thank you so much for joining us and taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
I kind of just wanted to start a little bit with your journey, just because as students I think that we're in one spot and you're in like such a far spot, and so it's hard for us to kind of feel like, how did you get there? You know, that kind of thing. You have so many books published, you have all these pieces in these really prestigious literary magazines, so I kind of thought maybe if you wanted to talk about your beginnings.
Yes, well, I read Moby Dick when I was 16 years old and quit writing for 5 years.
Okay.
And then I met these two, and I was a senior in college. I met these, because I decided that I wasn't smart enough or talented enough to be a writer after reading Melville, right? So then 5 years later, I meet these two guys. They weren't worried about whether they were smart enough or talented enough to take creative writing classes. And so they're lawyers. And when I was a senior in college at UC Santa Cruz, I took one writing class. We were kind of an, I guess, second wave creative writing programs. And so, I just kind of tried to do what other people were doing, which I now know is really bad for your writing. But I didn't know it at the time, so It took me a long time to sort of break out of that. Got my master's, and then I didn't work, because back in the 20th century, you didn't have to get a job right out of college. And so I just wrote. I took odd jobs and I wrote for 5 years, and then I heard about a PhD program where you could get paid for teaching, and and it was more money than I'd made to date, so I thought I would go to PhD school, where, in spite of myself, I got an education.
Okay.
And really, it was like ending up here that made me start to think systematically, both about teaching and, well, not writing. I mean, I learned that in PhD school, as I say, in spite of myself. Okay. So there was no master plan.
Awesome. Was there a teacher that stood out to you that really encouraged you, or were you kind of just on your own, I'm going to believe in myself and just go for it?
Well, there were two.
Okay.
There was one at Stanford, Albert Gerard, and I knew my writing didn't fit in, and so I was kind of experimenting in ways that I had never seen done before. I had read one experiment, and he was very, very supportive of that.
Awesome.
And at Utah, there was, my mentor was Francois Camoin, and he wasn't so convinced I could write until I actually showed up at campus. But once I did, and I convinced him I could, he was really an amazing supporter and fan, and wonderful man, yeah.
Well, I know from the grapevine, I haven't had the honor of taking class with you, but I know you were that for a lot of students here. So on behalf of them, I want to thank you for that. I want to get into your book. One thing that I was super interested in is where do you start when you're tackling a piece with a message, or do you always have a clear intention from the beginning? Because it seems like all your chapters are their own little piece of kind of a call to action. Is that? Yeah.
That is so interesting. Yeah, one of the fights I had with Francois that went on for 4 years is over the advisability of having a political motive in your work. And actually, I think I became a writer because I was a failed activist.
Okay. This makes sense. Yeah,
I really couldn't, I didn't have the temperament to be in the world. And anyway, but he taught me, and I have taught students ever since, not to think. And that the worst thing that you can do there's a bunch of bad things that you can do, but one of them is to overthink it. And I've always, like many writers, just started with a sentence, and have taught students that every sentence carries the imperative of its own next sentence. So writing is really more a process of paying attention to where you are. So where Francois and I kind of left it with the fight over whether writing should have, an activist message. And I don't really think of my work as being polemical at all, but where we left it is, I said, well, you know, at any given time, you have any number of sentences you can choose to write out of. I was really pleased. This book won an award for climate change writing. It inaugurates a new climate change fiction series, and I thought about it and I thought, well, man, I've been writing about climate change since the 1990s, maybe all my life. So
very cool. Yeah, it definitely seems like you have a care behind the pieces you write, and that comes off in like everything I've read of yours.
In the history of my writing life, I've really had sort of a series of sort of problems that I wanted to solve, and initially I worked with something that I learned to call disembodied narration. So then I ended up writing. Well, I didn't know to call it hybrid writing at the time, but that's what it was. And then somebody said, an editor at an important press said, well, I liked it better when you wrote plain old regular stories. And I thought, I don't know how to do that anymore. But then somehow, some way, I started writing fabulism, and what wasn't then called but would eventually be called ecofabulism.
Okay.
Whenever you finish something, you never know if you're going to be able to write again. So I wanted to work in microforms, and I wanted to go back to sort of hybrid work. So I conceived of a book, one sort of micro parable, sort of eco parable, and then a little micro essay or meditation under the same title. I wrote the book. It was a failure.
Okay.
So I ended up with 2 books.
Okay.
And this is one of them. And the other one is a book of essays, which also just won an award, and it's going to be published next year. So,
oh my gosh.
So
I'm so happy to hear that.
So yeah, I mean, yeah. I think it's a good lesson in failure, and how, you know, what Richard Hugo used to say is that the writers who make it are not necessarily the most talented, and not even those that write the most, that work the hardest, but those that take rejection the best. And these days we think of, you know, rejection, failure, you know, it has a place.
Oh, that's so cool. Well, your characters from What Happened Was have stuck with me. I'm kind of like just living with them as I go along my days now. So thank you so much for writing and for continuing to write and taking the time to share some of your soul with us, essentially.
Thank you, and thanks for your interest and your support.
Awesome.